Well, today I've moved away from the garden in Melbourne to a more elevated view of the Melbourne CBD. But you might not be able to see it, but it's certainly a totally deserted area and a very, very strange, eerie feeling about it. Today, the Westpac Consumer Sentiment Index was released and it printed a fall of 6.1%. That's got us back to the May level, so we lost all the gain that we saw in June, but it's still 16% above the low that we saw in April. Clearly, the main factor behind this disappointing deterioration has been the news about the shutdown in Melbourne. The survey occurred last week, so it covered the Tuesday when the shutdown was announced, and we saw quite a sharp fall in confidence, particularly in Melbourne on that particular day. Confidence picked up a little over the rest of the week, but generally we attribute most of this weakness to that shutdown in Melbourne. Indeed, if you look at the state numbers, Victoria was down by more than 10%, whereas the other states averaged around 4.5%, and most of them were very close to that 4.5%. So that's suggesting that the fall in the other states was very much consistently reflecting this concern about the Melbourne situation and whether it would spread to the other states. Now, what this survey hasn't captured is the rise of the concerning story for New South Wales that we saw over the weekend. The survey ended on Friday, and that news started to leak out around the weekend. So we don't know what that would have done to consumer confidence, but it's certainly a more updated, a more up-to-date measure of confidence than we saw in, say, the business survey we saw yesterday, which showed that business confidence improved from -20 to +1, but it didn't cover this major development that we've seen around the Melbourne shutdown last week. In terms of components of the index, we saw a very sharp fall in the outlook for the next 12 months. Not as big a fall as we saw back in April when it was down by 40%. This time it was down by more than around 15%. But still, people concerned about that. My bigger worry about the index was a 10% fall in the 5-year outlook. Bear in mind that in March, April, when we had the big shock to the index, that component only fell by 5%. And yet this month it's fallen by 10%. And I think it's sending a message that whereas people around April, May were thinking, well, we're going through the pain now, but we can see the way clearly out, now people are feeling more nervous that this process will take a lot longer, and the clear out that they were expecting in April, May will be much more difficult to achieve. We also saw that in how people felt about the unemployment outlook. That measure had been holding up particularly well, but that took a big 12.5% shock in the survey. The outlook for housing was surprisingly resilient. Time to buy was up by 4% nationally, although it was down by nearly 4% in Victoria, flat in New South Wales, but in the other states, it was up by 15% in South Australia and Queensland and about 8% in Western Australia. So that's being driven partly by the fact that affordability is so much stronger in those states, but also by the fact that I think there's more comfort about the risk of second waves in those states rather than in Victoria, of course, and the nagging concern in New South Wales. As we look forward to next week, all eyes will be on Thursday when the government will release its fiscal statement. Now, we expect it to release 2 years of economic forecasts, but more importantly, we'll get much more light on how the government plans to deal with the termination of the JobKeeper and JobSeeker, which is currently scheduled for the end of September. 2 weeks ago, we released our forecast for the forecast budget deficit in 2021. And we picked a number of 240 billion. That was up from an estimate 95 billion in 1920. Now, in that 240 billion was an expectation of 100 billion coming from the cyclical deficit, about 90 billion coming from policies that are already in place. $35 billion coming from further extensions of JobKeeper and JobSeeker, and around $15 billion coming from the budget in October. But let's focus on that $35 billion for JobSeeker and JobKeeper. Within that, $24 billion for JobKeeper and $11 billion for JobSeeker. They're the numbers that we'll be really focusing on from the government next Thursday. It is quite eye-popping to realise that in the June quarter, we estimate that government stimulus was around $60 billion, and in the September quarter, it's estimated to be around $90 billion. That includes money, one-off money for a $750 supplement for low-income earners and pensioners. It includes the JobKeeper payments, it includes the JobSeeker payments, it includes the drawdown on superannuation, and also the cash boost to small and medium enterprises. So there was a lot of money going into the economy in the September quarter. Now, most of those, with the exception of JobKeeper and JobSeeker, I expect to be terminated. Our numbers suggest that in that December quarter, the stimulus will be around $15 billion. So going from 60 to 90 down to 15. That is quite a challenge. But as I said, our deficit numbers were calculated before we saw this second shutdown in Victoria, and we saw this 6% fall in consumer sentiment today. So I have to say that our estimates, which included extending JobKeeper for 1 million workers, currently 3.4 million workers are receiving it, which I thought was quite a realistic approach. I have to say that given this latest information, our estimates might be on the low side. So we'll wait and see what the government decides next week, but today's 6.1% fall in consumer sentiment will be a significant factor in their thinking about their policy package that'll be announced next Thursday. Thank you.